My name is Natalie. I'm 38 years old, and I want to tell you about the morning my sister-in-law accidentally sent me a voice message that was meant for her mother. A voice message that was 43 seconds long and that contained, in those 43 seconds, enough information to reframe for years of my marriage in a single listen. And I want to tell you not just what was in it but what I did with it. Because the 43 seconds were the beginning, and what came after was entirely mine. I want to tell you about the specific experience of hearing your own name in a conversation you were never supposed to be part of, hearing it used in the specific way that people use names when they think no one who loves that name is listening, hearing it used as shorthand for problem, as the explanation for everything that has gone wrong, as the thing that needs to be removed so that everything can go back to the way it was before you arrived. And I want to tell you that hearing your name used that way by the people who were supposed to welcome you into a family is one of the most clarifying experiences a person can have, because it removes every last doubt, every generous interpretation, every benefit you have been extending for years to people who were never extending any to you. This is a story about what happens when a woman stops being patient with the wrong people and starts being strategic with the right information. If that is a story you need today, stay with me, subscribe to Unspoken Truth. And if you have ever felt like an outsider in a family that was supposed to be yours, hit that subscribe button, because what those 43 seconds set in motion is something I want you to hear. I had been with Joel Brennan for 6 years, married for 4. We had met in Boston when I was 31 at a fundraising event for a literacy nonprofit where I volunteered on weekends. Joel had been there representing a corporate sponsor. He was in logistics management, steady and warm and genuinely funny in the understated way of someone who does not need the room to know he is funny. He had volunteered to help stack chairs at the end of the evening, which I had found immediately and unreasonably charming. We had talked while stacking chairs and had gotten coffee the following Saturday and had fallen into each other with the ease of two people who recognize something in the other person that they had been looking for without knowing the shape of it. His family was in Connecticut, his mother Diana and his sister Renee. His father had passed away when Joel was in college, and the three of them had formed the specific tight unit that sometimes forms around loss, close in the way of people who have held each other through something hard and have not fully loosened the grip since. I had understood that closeness from the beginning and had approached it with genuine respect. I had not wanted to displace anything. I had wanted to be added to something, and I had believed, in the early years, that that was what was happening. Diana Brennan was a woman of 61 who had devoted the years since her husband's death to the project of her children's lives with an intensity that was dressed as love and that functioned, in practice, as something considerably more controlling. She was not openly hostile to me. I want to be clear about that because I think the openly hostile mother-in-law is actually easier to navigate than the one Diana was. She was warm in the specific performance of warmth. She remembered my birthday and asked about my work and said the right things in the right moments, and had told Joel on more than one occasion, in front of me, that she was so glad he had found someone like me, and I had believed her, or had wanted to believe her, or had chosen to believe her because the alternative required an examination I was not ready for. Renee was 34, 4 years younger than Joel. She worked in real estate in Hartford. She had the specific energy of a younger sibling who has always been slightly in competition with the older one and who has transferred that competition onto the older one's partner. She was not cruel to me directly, but she had a way of being in a room that made me feel like I was taking up space that belonged to someone else. Her comments had the particular quality of things that sound like observations but function as diminishments. She would say things like, "Natalie, you're so ambitious," with a tone that made ambitious sound like a warning, or, "Joel has always needed someone decisive around him," in a way that positioned my decisiveness as a management strategy rather than a personality. I had filed these things in the category of family dynamics I could not change and had chosen to manage rather than confront, because Joel was worth management and because I had been telling myself for years that the feeling was mine to handle. The voice message arrived on a Thursday morning and ended that particular category entirely. Renee had meant to send it to Diana. I know this because the message itself made clear it was a continuation of a conversation already in progress. It had the quality of a voice message sent in the middle of a longer exchange, referencing things already said, assuming context already established. It arrived in our text thread because Renee had been texting me the previous week about a family dinner and had sent it to the wrong thread without checking. A small error of the kind that people make when they are moving quickly and not thinking about what they are doing. The kind of error that in this case carried 43 seconds of information she would have been very careful to keep for me. I listened to it once standing in my kitchen with my coffee going cold on the counter, and then I sat down and I listened to it again. And I want to tell you what was in it because I think the specificity matters, not to be gratuitous but because the specific things she said were not the random venting of someone blowing off steam. They were specific and operational and told me things about what had been happening in my marriage that I had not known. She said, "Mum, I talked to Joe last night and he's still not ready to do anything. I told him what you said about the account and he said he needs more time. He keeps saying he doesn't want to hurt her, but honestly at this point I think she's more of a problem than he's admitting to you. And I need you to call him today because he listens to you more than he listens to me, and if we don't move on this before the end of the year the whole thing gets more complicated legally. Just call him. You know what to say." 43 seconds. I listened to it a third time and I identified the specific pieces that required immediate attention. The account. Which account? What had Diana said about it? Joe was not ready to do something. What something? The end of the year as a deadline. A legal complication after the end of the year. And the phrase more of a problem than his admitting. Which told me that there was a version of me being discussed in a conversation between my husband and his family that was different from the version of me I was living. I put my phone face down on the kitchen table and I sat for a moment with the specific internal stillness of someone who has just received a significant amount of information and needs to process it before deciding what to do with it. And then I picked the phone back up and I did not call Joel. I did not call Renee. I opened my contacts and I found the name of a woman I had met 2 years earlier at a professional networking event. A family attorney named Lorraine Hess who had given me her card. And whom I had not expected to need and whose card I had kept anyway because I was the kind of person who kept cards, and I called her. Lorraine answered on the second ring. It was 8:40 in the morning and she answered on the second ring, which told me something about her. I told her what I had in 7 minutes, the voice message, the specific language, the account reference, the end-of-year deadline, the legal complication, and she was quiet while I talked, and when I finished she said, "Natalie, I want you to do something right now before we go further. I want you to forward that voice message to your own email and to mine. Do it right now while we are on the phone. Because that message is evidence and I want it somewhere it cannot be deleted." I forwarded it while she waited. She confirmed receipt. And then she said, "I want to ask you some questions about your joint finances. I need to understand the full picture of what accounts you share and what assets you have together before I can tell you what the end of the year reference means legally." We talked for 31 minutes and by the end of those 31 minutes I had a clearer picture of my own financial situation than I had ever had. Not because I had been ignorant of it, but because Lorraine was asking questions that organized what I knew into a shape I had not seen before. And the shape, when I saw it, had a gap in it that I had not noticed. A joint investment account that Joel managed and that I had always trusted him to manage because he was better with numbers than I was. And because I had no reason not to trust him, an account whose recent statements I had not looked at closely, an account that Lorraine said I needed to look at today. I pulled up the statements on my laptop while she was still on the phone, and I found the gap, not a dramatic single withdrawal but the same incremental pattern I would later understand as the signature of a plan. Smaller amounts moved out of the joint account into a transfer I could not immediately trace, spread over 8 months, totaling, when I added them, just under $30,000. I said, "Lorraine, there is money missing." She said, "How much?" I told her, and she said, "Okay, I need you in my office this afternoon. Can you do 2 o'clock? I said yes, and she said, "Bring the account statements. Bring everything you can access. And Natalie, do not say anything to Joel today. I know that is hard, but I need you to wait until we have spoken in person." I said, "I understand." She said, "And I need you to save that voice message somewhere besides your phone. Send it to someone you trust outside this situation." I sent it to my sister BA. BA had been my older sister for 38 years and my anchor for most of them. She was 42 and lived in Portland and had the specific quality of someone who has navigated her own hard things and come out of them with a relationship to difficulty that is neither frightened nor reckless but simply steady. She called me back for minutes after I sent the message. She had listened to it. She said, "Nat, I am booking a flight." And I said, "You don't have to do that." And she said, "I'm already looking at tickets. I'll be there tomorrow morning." And I said, "BA." And she said, "I know, I'll be there." And I let her come because sometimes the most important thing you can do is let the people who love you be there when it matters. I went to Lorraine's office at 2. I brought the statements. I brought screenshots of the joint account transaction history going back 14 months. I brought the forwarded voice message and a document I had spent the morning building. A timeline of every incident in the past 2 years that I had filed in the wrong category. The comments that were not quite comments. The family conversations that had excluded me in ways I had explained away. The moments when Joel had seemed distant in a way that had a shape rather than being shapeless. The specific occasions when Diana had said something that landed like a stone through glass and that I had smoothed over because smoothing was what I had been doing. 14 pages. I had 14 pages by the time I walked into Lorraine's office, and when I put them on her desk she looked at them and then at me and said, "How long did it take you to write this?" And I said, "About 3 hours." And she said, "This is exactly what I need." And I thought, I have been here before, not literally but in the structure of it, the document, the attorney, the afternoon that changes the shape of what comes next. And I thought, I know how to do this. I have been preparing for this without knowing I was preparing. Every hard thing I ever managed quietly made me ready for this one. What Lorraine told me over the next hour I am going to share in the form it was shared with me, without softening it, because I think softening it would be a disservice to anyone listening who is in a version of this situation and needs the real shape of it. She said, the transfers from the joint account are consistent with a pattern she had seen before in cases where one spouse is preparing to separate and is moving assets ahead of a formal filing. She said the end-of-year reference in their voice message was likely related to tax year considerations that affect how assets are divided when a filing happens in a given calendar year versus the next. She said the phrase "more of a problem than his admitting" suggested that my husband had been representing our marriage to his family in terms that were designed to build a case for leaving rather than to accurately describe what was happening between us. And she said, this is the important part, that the involvement of his mother and sister in discussions about the account and the timing suggested a coordinated approach that had been in planning for longer than 8 months. I sat with that for a moment. Coordinated. The word sat in the room with a specific weight, not a husband who had drifted away and was being nudged toward a decision by a close family, but a family that had been actively involved in planning an outcome for my marriage that I had no knowledge of and no say in, a family that had been warm to my face and operational behind it, that had been calculating a legal timeline while bringing me birthday presents and asking about my work and saying their right things at the right moments. I thought about Diana saying she was so glad Joel had found someone like me, and I thought about Renee saying, "Natalie, you're so ambitious," with that particular tone, and I thought about for years of filing things in the wrong category, and I thought, you were never going to be in this family. They decided that before they gave you the chance, and the only question was whether you were going to find out before or after the thing they were planning was already done. I had found out before, by 43 seconds and a misdirected voice message and the specific gift of a sister-in-law who moved too fast on a Thursday morning. Lorraine said, "Here is what I want to do. I want to file a motion tomorrow morning that freezes the joint accounts pending full financial disclosure. This prevents any further transfers before we have a complete picture. It does not initiate divorce proceedings. It simply protects the assets while we assess the situation. Do you want me to do that?" I said yes. She said, "And I want you to think about whether you want to confront Joel before or after we file, because there are arguments for both." I thought about it for a moment. I thought about the voice message and the transfers and the coordinated timeline and the end-of-year deadline and the 14 pages I had written in 3 hours. And I said, after, I want to know the accounts are protected before I say a single word. She said, "Good. I'll file first thing tomorrow." Bea arrived at 7 the next morning with a bag and the particular energy of an older sister who has been frightened for her younger one and is now here and is not leaving. She walked in and looked at me with the assessing eye of someone checking for damage, and then she said, "You look clearer than I expected." And I said, "I've had 24 hours. And she said, "Tell me everything," and I did. sitting at the kitchen table while the coffee got cold the way coffee always gets cold when something important is being said. Lorraine filed at 9:15. She called me at 9:40 to confirm it was done, and I felt something settle in my chest at the words "it's done" in the way that things settle when a thing you feared losing is secured. The accounts were frozen, the transfers were on the record, the picture was documented, and Joel did not yet know any of it. He came home at 6:30. He stopped when he saw BEA at the kitchen table. He said, "Hey BEA, I didn't know you were coming." And BEA said, "Last minute," and smiled in the specific way she has of smiling when she's holding a great deal in. And Joel looked at me and I looked at him and I said, "Sit down, I need to show you something." I put my phone on the table with the voice message queued. I pressed play. I watched him listen to his sister's voice in the specific silence of a man who was hearing something he did not expect to hear in this room. And when it ended I said, "I want to ask you one thing before I tell you what I've done in the last 48 hours. I want you to tell me how long your mother and Renee have been involved in decisions about our marriage." He looked at the table. I said, "Joel, I need you to understand that Lorraine Hess filed this morning and the accounts are frozen. And I have 14 pages of documentation and the voice message and the transfer records. So the conversation we are having right now is not a conversation where either of us is going to benefit from being less than honest. Do you understand that?" He said, "How long have you known?" I said, 48 hours. I said, "How long have they been involved?" He said, "About a year." And then he said, "Natalie, it's not what you think." And I said, "I know what I heard. And I know what the accounts show. And I know that your family had a timeline for my marriage that I was not part of. And I need you to tell me what you were planning to do." And he told me, not everything at once, not cleanly, in the halting and partial way of someone whose plan has been exposed before it was finished and who is not yet sure what the honest version of events makes him. But enough for the shape of it to be clear. Diana had been pushing for a separation for 2 years. She had never believed I was the right person for Joel. She had been methodical in the way I was now understanding was her specific skill. Patient and consistent and dressed as concern. She had worked on him in the particular way of a mother who knows her son's weaknesses and knows how to speak to them. And Renee had been her instrument in the more direct operations, the conversations, the account discussions, the legal timing. And Joel had been listening, not because he did not love me, he said, but because the pressure had been sustained and he had not been strong enough to locate it as pressure rather than as truth. He had not been strong enough to locate it as pressure rather than as truth. I sat with that sentence for a long time after he said it. It is both an explanation and an indictment, and it is neither a full excuse nor a condemnation, and I turned it over many times in the weeks that followed trying to decide what to do with it. What I did with it was this. I told Joel that whatever happened between us was going to happen on terms that were honest and documented and handled by people who were equipped to handle it. I told him that Diana and Renee were not going to be part of any conversation about my marriage going forward, not as advisors, not as intermediaries, not as anything, and that if he could not agree to that as a starting condition then there was nothing further to discuss. And I told him that I had BEA in the next room and Lorraine on retainer and 14 pages of documentation and 43 seconds of audio that told a story his family had not intended me to hear. He agreed to the condition. We spent 4 months in couples therapy, real therapy, the kind that required him to examine his relationship with his mother with a specificity that was uncomfortable for him and that was, I think, genuinely new. He had never been asked to look at it as a dynamic rather than as simply love. And looking at it as a dynamic changed things, slowly and not without difficulty but genuinely. The therapist was a woman who had no interest in performing progress and who pushed both of us in directions we would not have chosen without her. I want to be honest about the outcome because I think honesty is what makes a story useful. Joel and I are still married. That is not the ending people expect, and I am not going to dress it as simple or complete because it is neither. It is the ongoing work of two people who went through something real and chose to stay and rebuild rather than leave. And the rebuilding is real and it is hard and it is also, on the good days, exactly what I chose and I'm glad I chose it. Diana I see twice a year, at Christmas and in the summer, on terms that Lorraine helped me establish clearly. She is smaller now in the specific way of people whose power over a situation has been formally reduced. She is correct with me in the way of someone who has understood that the landscape has changed and is navigating the new one. She has not said anything that sounds like an apology, and I have not waited for one. What I have is the truth acknowledged in legal terms and in behavioral terms, and that is sufficient. Renee called me 3 months after everything happened. She left a voicemail that I listened to once and did not return, not from anger but from clarity. There was nothing in that voicemail that changed the 43 seconds of the one that had started all of this, and I did not need her accounting of herself. I had enough accounts to manage. BA went back to Portland after a week and calls every Sunday and asks one question every time: "Are you okay?" And I answer honestly every time, which is sometimes yes and sometimes mostly, and occasionally I'm working on it. And she accepts all 3 answers with equal grace because she is BEA, and that is what she does. I think about the 43 seconds a great deal, about the specific accident of a message sent to the wrong thread on a Thursday morning when someone was moving too fast, and I think about what it means that the truth arrived that way, not through investigation or suspicion or dramatic confrontation, but through a misdirected voice message and a cold cup of coffee and a woman sitting at her kitchen table on an ordinary morning. And I think about the decision I made in the minutes after I listened to it, to photograph nothing yet but to call the right person, to build before I moved, to let the account be protected before I said a single word. The information that changes everything does not always arrive with a warning. Sometimes it arrives in 43 seconds on a Thursday. Sometimes it is an accident that is also, from another angle, exactly what you needed. The question is not whether you get the information. The question is what you do in the hours after you have it, whether you let the feeling drive or whether you let the strategy lead. And I have learned, at cost and with help, to let the strategy lead while the feeling does its work somewhere behind it where it belongs. The marriage is mine, and so is the truth, and so is the 43-second voice message that I have kept in a folder on my phone, not because I need it anymore, but because it is the sound of the moment when I stopped being patient with the wrong people, and I find it occasionally useful to remember exactly what that sounds like. My name is Natalie. I'm 38 years old, and my sister-in-law sent me a voice message by accident that was 43 seconds long and that contained enough information to change the shape of my marriage, my finances, and my future. And I spent 48 hours building something solid before I said a single word. And everything I kept because I was steady when the people who underestimated me expected me to fall apart. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourself. And remember, sometimes the truth arrives by accident, and what you do in the first 48 hours after it arrives is everything.